I should make a video about that. Hey, there's a new pope, Leo the 14th, and luckily for us, he actually seems pretty cool so far. I mean, not very cool. Like, I wasn't holding out hope he'd be a leftist or anything like that, but Leo 14 appears not to be insane, which was a worry for a few weeks, what with the recent state of world politics. Leo was also the first American pope, which would be really cool if it wasn't so frightening given the state of American politics. There is also a small but palpable movement within the Catholic Church, which to me has always felt essentially fascist in nature, and Catholics generally are susceptible to reactionary politics for purely aesthetic reasons. That said, it would be inaccurate to characterize the politics of the Catholic Church as explicitly fascist or even straightforwardly conservative. You could say that about other Christian movements, but Catholicism is far more nuanced and, owing to its thousand-year history and its importance in European society, far more philosophically informed. Due to this tradition and continuing developments in the world generally, the specific doctrines pertaining to Catholicism's politics are still developing. Therefore, it's reasonable to suspect that the new pope may have a tremendous impact on future politics. When new popes are elected, it is customary to take a new name. Cardinal Prevost has chosen the name Leo XIV, which is a nod to one of the most important popes in recent history, Leo XIII, who in 1891 wrote an encyclical letter titled Rerum Novarum, which Leo XIV has publicly cited as the reason for his name choice and for being very influential for his own worldview. For those unfamiliar, an encyclical letter is a document written by the Pope addressed to all the bishops of the Catholic Church. Encyclical letters are sent out from time to time to clarify the Church's official stance on some issue and to guide the clergy as they navigate the topic in their own liturgies. They are very important documents in Catholicism. Not quite on par with the Bible, but definitely up there with other church writings like Aquinas' Summa Theologiae or Augustine's Confessions. Rerum Novarum is credited as the encyclical which initiated Catholic social teaching, CST, as my high school apologetics teacher called it. CST became relevant in 19th century Catholicism as it responded to the Second Industrial Revolution, which was rapidly altering society, corroding a social order that had functioned for centuries, and creating new problems which were clearly economic in nature. And this had the effect of driving people more and more towards radical politics. As we'll see, Rerum Novarum explicitly rejects socialism, though it also isn't accurate to say the Church favors laissez-faire capitalism. In fact, many encyclical letters, including Rerum Novarum, have been heavily critical of capitalism. Pope John Paul II even wrote, "The Church, since Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, has always distanced itself from capitalistic ideology, holding it responsible for grave social injustices. In Quadragesimo Anno, Pius XI, for his part, used clear and strong words to stigmatize the international imperialism of money." Lots of Catholics, including Leo XIV, hail Rerum Novarum, and by extension CST, for its supposed sobriety and humanistic intent to find a middle ground between unrestricted capitalism and authoritarian socialism. However, this interpretation doesn't account for the historical context it came from, or the outcomes it produced, and is in my opinion a very surface-level reading. Lots of people want to read this book, or pretend to have read it, in a vacuum, and all politics sounds nice when you abstract it far enough. All criticism sounds intelligent if you don't catch the straw man. Rerum Novarum on the surface purports to solve issues of class dynamics, in particular to help the working class. At the outset, Leo states his aim is to address the condition of this class. In any case, we clearly see that some opportune remedy must be found quickly for the misery and wretchedness pressing so unjustly on the majority of the working class. And this is generally accepted at face value. However, upon closer inspection, I don't think that's what this document is doing, though it is certainly doing a lot. So in this essay, I want to argue that the real function of Rerum Novarum, far from helping the working class, is actually quite sinister and should rather be understood as one of the ideological kernels that paved the way for fascism. This is a big deal because Rerum Novarum is possibly the most important encyclical letter in recent history. You can go to Catholic forums or look up lists of the top 10 most important encyclical letters, and Rerum Novarum will almost always be on top. This is because it inspired so many other encyclicals, including Quadragesimo Anno, Montere Magistra, Pacem in Terris, Populorum Progressio, Laborum Exercens, Centesimus Annus, and most recently Laudato Si. Full explanation of Catholic social teaching can be found in these documents, but the original ideas all trace back to Rerum Novarum. 2 encyclical letters reference Rerum Novarum in their titles, and all but 2 explicitly reference Rerum Novarum. A full explanation of Catholic social teaching is beyond the scope of this video, however many people point to an unofficial set of 7 key themes proposed by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. These are sanctity of human life and dignity of the person, call to families and communities in pursuing the common good, rights and responsibilities about social justice, options for the poor, dignity of work, solidarity in earthly goods, and care for God's creation. And after going over the aforementioned encyclicals, I think this is a fair summary. It's a good list. There's nothing here I really take issue with. My concern, rather, is that this list abstracts CST from the encyclical letters they derive from, as the encyclicals themselves abstract away from the context they were written in. To a certain extent, that's unavoidable when you write anything, but I think it's kind of intellectually irresponsible to ignore the fact that most encyclical letters have explicitly political agendas, in particular Rerum Novarum. For example, this list won't tell you that during the 1848 revolutions, the Pope was forced to flee the Vatican. It won't tell you that in the 1890s, unmarried and widowed women have more property rights than married women. It won't remind you that a century earlier, the Catholic Church was a main antagonist in the French Revolution, and having already witnessed its power diminish as revolution swept Europe, had a vested interest in undermining emancipatory politics. So in this video, I want to take a closer look at the original text, as well as the context it came from, and figure out if there's anything we should be worried about, and whether we can offer some constructive criticism. Before I get to that, I want to make something clear, especially since this is kind of an open letter to Leo XIV. This is not an attack on the Catholic Church. The thing that bothers me so much about Rerum Novarum isn't that it's Catholic, it's that this is a fundamentally bad interpretation of Christianity. I'm not Catholic anymore, but this document is deeply unsettling for me personally, not because it offends my politics, but because it perverts the few things I still like about Christianity. It offends me as someone whose Catholicism is still deeply ingrained in them, even as an atheist. It's riddled with irreconcilable contradictions, it's out of joint with Jesus' teachings, it's frankly blasphemous in its mischaracterization of what Christianity should be. I hope I don't come across as hyperbolic. It's just I've read this document more than 50 times by now, and it has thoroughly upset me. So what is Rerum Novarum, and what is its influence on contemporary Catholicism? Rerum Novarum was written in the midst of the Second Industrial Revolution, and roughly translates to "of new things," though its subtitle, Rights and Duties of Capital and Labor, is closer to what it's actually about. And in my opinion, it can be broken down into the following sections. The first 3 paragraphs introduce Leo's concern that, due to rapid changes in society, including but not limited to expansions of industrial pursuits, new science, changing relationships between masters and workers, and extreme wealth disparity, it isn't surprising that the people affected by these changes would be driven towards radical politics. And this was especially true in late 1800s Europe. You don't have to dig too deeply to figure out that this is Leo's primary concern. He writes, "Crafty agitators are intent on making use of these differences of opinion to pervert men's judgment and to stir up the people to revolt," which he condemns. At the same time, it's painfully clear that the free market, void of any economic regulations like the guild system, is reducing the condition of the working class to poverty, which Leo also condemns. Therefore, according to Leo, it has become the duty of the Church to refute false teachings by clarifying the respective rights and duties of capital and labor. The guild system, which I discussed in my last video, had been in decline for centuries, and was first formally abolished in France during the 1789 French Revolution, around a century before Rerum Novarum. It's important to remember the French Revolution was in many ways a bourgeois revolution, which is why its legacy is so ambiguous. On the one hand, the French Revolution paved the way for the dominance of capitalism. On the other hand, the French Revolution is often praised as a clear example of the dialectic of history. You can celebrate it from both the perspective of a capitalist or from the perspective of a Marxist, but this very ambiguity makes both criticism and praise perfect conduits for hidden political messages. Imagine a worker in the 19th century, young enough to experience the harsh realities of economic deregulation, but old enough to vaguely remember regulations under feudalism. One way of dealing with this is, of course, socialism, i.e., to move beyond capitalism and establish greater democracy. However, on the flip side, it wouldn't be difficult to convince him that the solution to society's problems isn't to look forward to a socialist future, but to go back to the regulations set by the guild system. No matter that guild system economies created the very conditions which led to economic deregulation in the first place. My point in saying all this is, even if you're fully cognizant of all the problems unique to modern capitalism, but you leave out historical material analysis, you can actually end up with a very conservative politics, because at that point in analysis, you're forced to make a choice between going through the system you criticize or turning back to older systems, and this is one origin of conservative politics. Leo wants to criticize capitalism, but is ultimately ideologically unable to move beyond it, and through this inability, ultimately ends up justifying it in its most vicious form. Leo starts by explicitly rejecting socialism, which he identifies as wanting to do away with private property, and argues that, instead of helping the situation, this would actually negatively affect the working class in particular. He says it's inherently unjust because it would rob the lawful possessor, distort the function of the state, and create confusion among the masses. He says men labor for the express purpose of acquiring property, which they should then have full control over, and that man has a natural right to property, and this is something that separates him from animals, which only desire things for short-term consumption. Man, on the other hand, has need for things which last. Leo takes this further and says it is the right of men to take the wages that they have earned by laboring and invest them in land, which is not like a normal commodity because it lasts over time and keeps producing fruit if it's looked after. Socialists want to expropriate land, therefore socialists rob wage earners of what would otherwise be rightfully theirs. He contextualizes this by articulating his vision for a cohesive society, explaining that the family unit is a tiny society with rights and duties of its own. The aforementioned property rights must belong to the man at the head of a household. This is because it is his duty to provide for his children and to set them up to succeed, and according to Leo, this is only possible via the transmission of productive property to them through inheritance, which he makes clear should be facilitated through traditional family hierarchy. At this point, he takes an idea from Aquinas that children are really the continuation of their father's personality, that they are the property of the father, and that they therefore take their place in society not of their own right, but in their quality as a member of the family into which they are born, i.e., the social rank you're born into is natural. Ultimately, though, no matter your position in society, the father has authority over his family. He ties this all back to his rejection of land expropriation, since the father should have his own property in order to care for his own family. Though he doesn't explicitly state it, it's pretty clear that for Leo, socialism entails a heavy centralized state apparatus. Therefore, in addition to the rights of capital and labor, he also enumerates limitations for state intervention later on in the text, and these preclude that the state should mostly stay out of family affairs. Socialists, wanting to communalize the family, want to do away with this entire dynamic on the basis that human beings are all created equal and that unjustified hierarchies should be dismantled. But for Leo, the hierarchy is natural, and socialists are ultimately fighting against nature. Leo predictably condemns this. The socialists, therefore, in setting aside the parent and setting up a state supervision, act against natural justice and destroy the structure of the home. He insists that no solution will come from socialism, and instead we need to look to the church for answers. Despite not being able to properly define socialism, he directly attacks it by denying the basic premise of socialist class analysis. The great mistake made in regard to the matter now under consideration is to take up with the notion that class is naturally hostile to class, and that the wealthy and the working men are intended by nature to live in mutual conflict. Is it ordained by nature that these two classes should dwell in harmony and agreement? Each needs the other. Capital cannot do without labor, nor labor without capital. And he says that the church should act as mediator between classes. He then goes on to list the duties of workers to employers. These include to fully and faithfully perform the work which has been freely and equitably agreed upon, to never injure the property nor outrage the person of an employer, to never resort to violence in defending their own cause, nor to engage in riot or disorder, and to have nothing to do with men of evil principles, who work upon the people with artful promises of great results, and excite foolish hopes which usually end in useless regrets and grievous losses. And the duties of employers to workers, not to look upon their workpeople as their bondsmen, but to respect in every man his dignity as a person ennobled by Christian character. The employer is bound to see that the worker has time for his religious duties. The employer is bound to see that the worker be not exposed to corrupting influences and dangerous occasions. The employer is bound to see that the worker be not led away to neglect his home and family, or to squander his earnings. The employer must never tax his workpeople beyond their strength. The employer must never employ them in work unsuited to their sex and age. His great and principal duty is to give everyone what is just. To defraud anyone of wages that are his due is a great crime, which cries to the avenging anger of heaven. Lastly, the rich must religiously refrain from cutting down the workman's earnings, whether by force, by fraud, or by usurious dealings. The popular way of reading this is as the church formalizing workers' rights, and this eventually leading to a better, more equitable society. It's a nice story, but here's an alternative way of looking at it. The main takeaway I get from this is that workers need to be obedient, but capitalists need to give workers fewer reasons to be disobedient. Not necessarily because it is just, but because being openly dictatorial will lead some people to rebel. It's all very paternalistic, and a great example of how human rights do not come from some sort of divine revelation. They are not simply self-evident as the Declaration of Independence suggests, but rather arise as compromises between classes. The aim of rights is not to protect the innate dignity of citizens, but to keep them complacent, since the ruling class knows that by subjugating the population too much and too openly would result in them developing class consciousness. It therefore limits itself in order to preserve itself. This was not always done out of malice. It's not accurate to portray tendencies in capitalism as though it were some sort of conspiracy. However, reading closely, Leo really seems to be conscious of the quelling effect workers' rights will have on people. He justifies them over and over by saying they'll prevent unrest. He ends this section by reminding us that really we're all equal in that we're all trying to get to heaven, and if you're rich, that's going to be harder for you than if you are poor. If you have excess, it is your duty to give the remainder to charity. He leans back into the motif that classes should cooperate with each other, and that this would be better than some system of taxation or redistribution. He says any system of relief organized by the state will never be as good as Christian charity, before going on to enumerate the rights and duties of the state. For whatever reason, he takes much longer to explain this section, so I'll just flash through the quotes as I summarize. Feel free to pause if you'd like to read the entire quote. Leo says, "The state should make laws and institutions that realize public well-being and private prosperity. The state must regard the interests of all as equal. The interests of the working class should be given careful consideration. The state should not absorb the individual or the family. The state may intervene if classes are threatened or suffer, if workers strike, if work is interrupted, if family ties weaken, if people become less religious, if different sexes are commingling at work, or if you give children more work than is suitable for them. Rights must be religiously respected, especially property rights. The state must protect private property. The law should prevent people from getting to this point in the first place, and the state is not in its right to tax people too much and to expropriate private property." Then he enumerates several societal regulations to fix capitalism, some of which has already been said. You need Sunday off so you can go to church. We need to save people from people who would use people as mere instruments for money-making. There needs to be regulation of labor. We need to regulate when we rest, as in Sunday, and also what kind of work requires more rest. Women and children should not be subject to the same sort of work that men are subjected to. And he says the law should favor ownership and induce as many people as possible to become owners. The problem for Leo is the wide class division. The solution is to bring the classes nearer to one another, not by abolishing class division, of course, no matter that he admits this is a problem, but by minor reforms meant to curtail this tendency in capitalism. Further confusing things, Leo explains that workers' unions are actually very important. Unions are a good thing, and Catholics should support them. Unless they want to do revolution, then they are a very bad thing. Leo also condemns closed shops, a standard union goal. He says that Christians should form their own Catholic unions, rather than be subject to the goals and tendencies of a traditional radical union. Working men's associations should be set up to help each individual member obtain property. It makes sense that workers would be drawn to radical socialist unions in the current climate, so Catholic unions must be set up to guide them away from this error. The cure for social ills for Leo is not revolutionary change or anything a union would be capable of, but charity. Charity is the antidote, and he ends the letter by telling us to teach charity to men of all classes. Rerum Novarum is a very frustrating document. I can't tell if it's purposefully crafted propaganda or just philosophically confused. It's clear that Leo has some kind of concern for the poor, but he makes it perfectly clear that he in no way wants any kind of structural changes in society. Even so, the way he phrases the problems he wishes to address is alarmingly sober and understanding, yet the solutions he proposes are utterly ineffectual, even nonsensical. Capitalism's insane adaptability, one of its key distinctions from mercantilism, is either entirely foreign to Leo or he just ignores it, but it's critical to understand his solutions would never work because capital will just adapt around them. Many people from Marx to Zizek to Deleuze have pointed this out, but I'm particularly fond of Mark Fisher's description. The limits of capital are not fixed by fiat, but defined and redefined pragmatically and improvisationally. Capitalism is a monstrous, infinitely plastic entity, capable of metabolizing and absorbing anything it comes into contact with. And this is why Marx and Engels' socialism is so compelling, and so much more influential than other contemporaneous socialisms. Where other people tried to fix or limit the outcomes of capitalism, Marx and Engels always sought to destroy the inner core at the center of capitalist logic itself, which inevitably breaks through whatever limitation is imposed on it. I'll talk about this later in the essay when we discuss capitalism's role in the state, but for a more concrete example of this, consider labor laws. Consider the labor laws Leo is proposing in Rerum Novarum. Whatever workers' rights, child labor laws, or minimum wage regulations we win are only safe so long as the capitalists who populate the legislature let them alone. Capitalists will inevitably make up the majority of Congress because they have the capital required to win elections, and they, like all people, will act in their own interests. I think this is the main appeal corporatism has for fascists. It sounds nice for workers whose political imagination only goes so far as human rights. It doesn't occur to these workers that rights are basically a promise, or that we could have more security than just mere promises. It also lets the fascist appear like he is the guarantor of these rights, because he is. Many workers, convinced of the fundamental reality of rights and abhorred at the idea of their construction, won't be angry, but confused at the violation of their rights. But this situation is precisely constructed to enable fascists to work around workers' rights. Additionally, this presents a perfect and very ironic opportunity for new fascists to swoop in to defend workers' rights, but if you dig below the surface, all they're doing is perpetuating a broken system. This tendency is apparent in Rerum Novarum, as well as the many other documents like it. This kind of vague, wishy-washy populism that sounds leftist even though it's conservative. One thing I immediately notice is that he kind of bounces back and forth between sounding almost like a socialist to sounding like a fascist. This is a proto-fascist document. It flatly rejects any kind of socialism and is therefore implicitly anti-democracy. It's extremely patriarchal, which is a word I don't use lightly. It subscribes to the idea that the social hierarchy is an innate part of reality and fetishizes the kind of perfectly hierarchical society fascists cream over. Its overall sentiment is that society has lost its way and needs to return to how things were before. It is firmly convinced that property rights are fundamentally good, and it flat out rejects the view that the working and owning classes are naturally in conflict with one another, and even asks them to just get along. But at the same time, it stresses the importance of trade unions. It acknowledges the extreme wealth divide between the workers and the capital class, and states that this is a problem. He even states that wage labor is only marginally better than slavery, which I've heard a lot from socialists, but it's odd hearing it from the leader of the Catholic Church. He is also well aware of the importance of labor to the wealth of society. Though he doesn't precisely spell it out, he seems to approximate something like the labor theory of value. He rejects the idea that any transaction being freely agreed to is always necessarily an equal exchange, which is the common argument made by conservatives to justify wage labor. He even goes on to say, "Is it just that the fruit of man's own sweat and labor should be possessed and enjoyed by anyone else? As effects follow their cause, so is it just and right that the results of labor should belong to those who have bestowed their labor." That's like our whole ethos. The fundamental motivating idea, at least for me, is that by working, you transmit part of your personality into the object you work on. That in some sense, you are the commodity, and you should therefore have control of the commodity. You should have control of the full product of your labor for exactly the same reason that you should have full control of your body. And if not, then you should have full control of something else of equivalent value. Yet Leo takes this argument and pivots right back to the inviolability of property rights. That is, he arrives at the exact reverse of the position found in the Communist Manifesto, using the same reasoning as the manifesto. And this should be central to our understanding of it, since at its core, Rerum Novarum is a defense of private property and the role of property in society. All the other themes follow from this conviction. It's not surprising, therefore, that in his description of virtuous society, women and children are essentially the property of the father, and the male worker's ability to attain private property is important for precisely this reason. As he explains in paragraph 13, that right to property must in likewise belong to a man in his capacity of head of a family. It is a most sacred law of nature that a father should provide food and all necessaries for those whom he has begotten. And similarly, it is natural that he should wish that his children who carry on, so to speak, and continue his personality, should be by him provided with all that is needful to enable them to keep themselves decently from want and misery amid the uncertainties of this mortal life. Now, in no other way can a father effect this except by the ownership of productive property, which he can transmit to his children by inheritance. You can see the aforementioned CST theme, call to family, though again, what that list won't tell you is how intertwined it is with these rather heavy-handed themes of patriarchy. In the next paragraph he adds, "Paternal authority cannot be abolished, for it has the same source as human life itself. The child belongs to the father, and is as it were the continuation of the father's personality, and speaking strictly, the child takes its place in civil society, not of its own right, but in its quality as member of the family in which it is born." The socialists, therefore, in setting aside the parent and setting up a state supervision, act against natural justice and destroy the structure of the home. As previously mentioned, Leo references Thomas Aquinas' idea that children are property of the father, and as corollary to this, Leo doesn't view children as having equal rights to exist in society. He uses this to justify social stratification, such as that between worker and owner. He makes the implicit argument that the capitalist hierarchy is natural, more or less due to birthright. I think that for modern audiences, the idea of a natural hierarchy in society would be ridiculous at face value. This part kind of just offends me as an American, honestly. I know this letter is Italian, but the idea that all men are created equal is one of the crowning achievements of modernity, even if it doesn't perfectly align with how modern society actually is. The sentiment is good, and Leo just flat out denies it. The theme of patriarchy, of course, also extends to Italian women, who did not have equal property rights until 1975. In the 1890s, when Leo was writing, married women did not have full legal rights to their earnings, and were largely under the legal control of their husbands. Interestingly, you actually had more rights if you were unmarried or a widow, so Leo's call to family is in effect a call to women to submit their property rights to a husband. It's not surprising that Rerum Novarum would be found favorable by fascists in the coming decades, like this one in my comments section. It outlines the kind of idyllic social hierarchy which fascists fetishize, and proposes that this is not only good, but natural, even inescapable. Leo wants to build this harmonious social order, but also understands that class dynamics are a major cause of society's problems, and his solution is to bring the classes closer together by getting propertyless workers to slowly, legally obtain property. He wants as many men to be property owners as possible. Inferring from this, and his attitudes towards large capitalists throughout the rest of the text, it seems like Leo wants the sort of society where everyone can become a small business owner. To accomplish this, he explicitly advocates for workers to invest their wages in land. Socialist expropriation of land for common use would make this impossible, and is therefore antithetical to Leo's vision. I find this almost offensive in how short-sighted it is. Leaving aside any socialist criticism I could come up with, land is a finite resource, and according to Leo, there will be natural social stratification in society. It follows that people with more resources will over time accumulate more and more land than people without resources, making for fewer landowners and ever higher land prices. And there's no reason to suspect this would ever stop. This is easy to see in contemporary America, where it's literally a meme that Gen Z can't afford housing, but it's not hard to predict that this would happen. We live on a planet, and there's only so much planet. The cruel irony of modern property rights is that they inevitably lead to fewer and fewer people owning property. And yet Leo's conviction that private property rights are good for the working class is a key concept in Rerum Novarum. His basic criticism of socialism is that we don't understand this, that we would hurt workers by taking away the property they worked hard for. As he puts it, it is clear that the main tenet of socialism, community of goods, must be utterly rejected, since it only injures those whom it would seem meant to benefit. That isn't the main tenet of socialism. And as a brief side note, at the time Leo was writing, there was not yet a clear distinction between socialism and communism. The idea that socialism precedes communism comes from Lenin, but before that it was common to use them more or less interchangeably. Therefore, even though Leo doesn't explicitly use the word Marxism, for the purposes of this essay, I'm going to assume he's basically responding to Marx, since Marxism was a major socialist current of that period, and because, as we'll see, there are many moments in Rerum Novarum where Leo appears to be alluding to the Communist Manifesto, or at least to things he's heard about the manifesto, such as in the above quote. And this is one reason I think he's heard the slogans of the manifesto, but hasn't actually read it, because, as if anticipating Leo by almost 40 years, Marx responded to this very accusation. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. But modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products, that is based on class antagonisms, on the exploitation of the many by the few. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. We communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as the fruit of a man's own labor, which property is alleged to be the groundwork of all personal freedom, activity, and independence. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. Do you mean the property of the petty artisan and of the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There is no need to abolish that. The development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it, and is still destroying it daily. Or do you mean the modern bourgeois private property? But does wage labor create any property for the laborer? Not a bit. It creates capital, i.e., that kind of property which exploits wage labor, and which cannot increase except upon condition of begetting a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation. Property in its present form is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor. Marx made it pretty clear that he's not against you owning your toothbrush. You can still own things under communism. The problem Marx identified isn't with property generally, but that sort of property which has adverse effects on the rest of society, i.e., capital. The problem with capital is that its defining feature is that it is the condition for value production, and it can be privately owned. This leaves the owner of capital in the position to persuade other people to work for him. Therefore, capital is the means for one person to extract value from another person in an unequal exchange. For Marx, that's a mode of exploitation, and therefore he envisioned a society without it. But this doesn't mean you won't be able to own stuff. In a roundabout way, socialism itself is motivated by the sort of property rights Leo was talking about. Conservatives had this idea that socialists want things like redistribution of wealth on some kind of moral basis, or because we're really into sharing or something. This makes it seem like leftists made up an ethical principle from nothing and then based their whole politics around it, when in reality, socialists want wealth redistribution not because it's good, but because that wealth is theirs. It was taken from them. At the heart of left-wing politics, therefore, is a claim about property rights, just one very different from conventional property rights. The confusion is that conservatives and people generally view wage labor as a free transaction, but many socialists view it as a kind of theft, and you don't systematically, continuously steal from someone and not expect them to resist. Socialism is not about sharing. Far from it. Socialism is precisely intended to safeguard personal property in the way people assume capitalist property rights do currently. The thing conservatives miss, or just ignore, is that private property rights do not ensure your right to property. They ensure capitalists' right to capital. Leo's mischaracterization of socialism and his frankly juvenile understanding of capitalism entirely misses this. In stark contrast to his vision of a society where every worker owns a small plot of land for his own, modern property rights create conditions for capital consolidation, meaning ever faster extraction and less property for average people. And wouldn't you know it, property is harder to come by than ever. Leo's contention that private property must be inviolable reminds me a lot of the above quote, because it appears as the inverse of Marx's thesis that communism can be summarized as abolition of private property. Leo actually does this a few times. The way he phrases many of his positions almost seems like they're formulated to be the exact reverse of many positions in the manifesto. For example, he directly or indirectly contradicts abolition of private property, abolition of inheritance, collectivization of land, the right of children not to be exploited by their parents, and the idea that the working class and owning class are inherently hostile to each other. These ideas aren't just slogans. Marx didn't pull them out of thin air. He supported them because they are necessary conditions to bring about the transition into communism. It's common for people to get upset and turned away by these principles, but this is often because they are stated in a vacuum and not placed in context. Just like with private property generally, the right to land does not ensure that people will be landowners. The idea behind land collectivization is no one will be able to consolidate it and hold sway over tenants. Similarly, the purpose behind abolition of inheritance is to prevent this accumulation from happening as well. It's important to remember that Marx is talking about capital. If your dad dies and wills you his collection of World War II memorabilia, or your mom leaves you her furniture, you should still be able to receive these because they aren't capital. However, if your dad owns a factory, or a company, or 10,000 acres of arable land, these are not mere personal possessions, but means of production, and so would be collectivized. This is actually a lot tamer than many people's vision of violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie. You could make a good argument that a legitimate interpretation of this point is that instead of rolling in guillotines and killing every capitalist we find, we allow their enterprise to continue, with the addendum that once they're done with it, it becomes common property. Admittedly, I don't like that interpretation, and would prefer a much more direct revolution. However, even in this situation, abolition of inheritance still has its place. A criticism you sometimes hear about communism is that nobody would be incentivized to start businesses or make anything new, and I actually think it's a legitimate concern. Personally, I think the way around it is to create new rights for people who create new things. Not quite on par with capitalist property rights, but approximating them. There should still be incentive to create, but this incentive should not persist past the point of death, because this is the point at which no incentive can inspire a person to create anything anymore, and thus their creations, which benefited them in life and can no longer benefit them, will be transferred to the community. Incidentally, I got this idea from this CGP Grey video about copyright laws, linked in the description, where he discusses how copyright should last the length of the author's life. I entirely agree, except I think this should be expanded to encompass basically all new business enterprises. It wouldn't be as simple as I describe it, but the basic guiding principle would be maintain incentive to create, then communize when it's no longer an incentive, but I digress. My point in saying all this is to show that abolition of inheritance does not mean you can't inherit your grandmother's wedding ring, just as abolition of private property doesn't mean you can't own a toothbrush. And throughout Rerum Novarum, Leo never acknowledges this, rendering his criticism kind of worthless, since he's basically just setting up straw men. He doesn't refute or even really engage with any socialist theory, and anyone who's even passingly familiar will see this. What he does do, however, is lay a clear ideological foundation for fascism. And if you read later fascist literature, this influence becomes uncomfortably palpable. I'm sure there are many examples, but I'm personally most familiar with Mussolini's On the Doctrine of Fascism, which is about as straightforward a primary source as you can ask for. Reading these documents beside one another is enlightening, because there are several several crystal clear examples where Leo and Mussolini reach essentially the same conclusion. Both are critical of liberalism, both are critical of socialism, both heavily emphasize hierarchy and tradition, both stress that society has lost its way and needs to turn back to some idealized, long-gone past, both emphasize the role of institutional authority, both appeal to spirituality to ground their politics, and most importantly, both are trying to preserve a social order by explicitly endorsing class collaborationism. Consider this excerpt from Mussolini. Fascism is likewise opposed to trade unionism as a class weapon, but when brought within the orbit of the state, fascism recognizes the real needs which gave rise to socialism and trade unionism, giving them due weight in the guild or corporative system, in which divergent interests are coordinated and harmonized in the unity of the state. Leo says more or less the same thing when he speaks of the classes needing each other, that classes should work together, that workers should set up separate, specifically non-socialist unions, which, let's face it, are the corporative bodies Mussolini is talking about. Both of them are advocating a system where the two classes get together to try to work towards common interests. That gets me to Rerum Novarum's other main theme after property rights. Leo also states, the great mistake made in regard to the matter now under consideration is to take up with the notion that class is naturally hostile to class, and that the wealthy and the working men are intended by nature to live in mutual conflict. So irrational and so false is this view that the direct contrary is the truth. This is another example where Leo seems to purposefully formulate his thesis as the exact reverse of Marx and Engels' position in the manifesto. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinct feature. It has simplified the class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. Thus we are introduced to Rerum Novarum's other major theme, collaboration between classes, or as the stupids insist on calling it, corporatism. On that note, my last video did really well. I'm very pleased that so many people saw it, and I'm genuinely very thankful for all the positive feedback in my comment section. However, some people did not like that video, not due to any theoretical error or historical inaccuracy, but because of my misuse of the word corporatism. Now, I could talk about how I addressed this misuse in the video, or about how words have multiple meanings. I considered making a follow-up video, but I could also just briefly touch on it here. It's such a nonsense ideology, I don't even recognize its legitimacy to use that word. It's just a front for fascism. It is a primary component in, and precursor to, every fascist society. When historical fascists come to power, they don't talk about building a police state, or concentration camps, or suspending civil liberties, but they seem to consistently and openly talk about getting the working and owning classes to cooperate. I provided examples elsewhere of Hitler and Mussolini doing this, but this tendency is everywhere in fascism. Francisco Franco's Phalangist Manifesto, the 26-point program of the Phalange, explicitly calls for corporatism in point 9, stating, our conception of Spain in the economic reality is that of a gigantic syndicate of producers. We shall organize Spanish society corporatively through a system of vertical syndicates for the various fields of production, all working towards national economic unity. If you travel west to the Portuguese fascist Salazar, you'll quickly find that he reformed the Portuguese state into the corporatist Estado Novo. And it should also be noted that this system was heavily influenced by the encyclical letter Quadragesimo Anno, as well as Rerum Novarum. The Croatian fascists, the Ustashi, actively called for a third economic system, beyond both capitalism or communism. Historians have occasionally called this national Catholicism or political Catholicism, though it's pretty clear upon basic analysis that they're just calling for corporatism. If you visit the Wikipedia page for the Austrian fascist leader, Engelbert Dollfuss,
Stupid name.
you'll
What?
quickly find that he modeled Austria according to Catholic corporatist ideals, with anti-secularist tones, and in a similar way to Italian fascism. What about South American fascists? The Brazilian fascist Getulio Vargas included corporatist principles in his 1934 constitution, and justified it, saying it would unite all classes in mutual interest. Juan Perón, Argentina's fascist dictator, is on record praising Italian fascism precisely for its corporatism. Italian fascism brought the popular organizations into effective participation in national life, from which the people had always been excluded. Until Mussolini's rise to power, the nation was on one side and the worker on the other, and the latter had no part in it. I discovered the resurgence of the corporations and studied them in depth. If the ideology just collapses into fascism, then not simply calling it proto-fascism is misleading. The word itself is somewhat propagandistic. Even so, I can see how the title "Corporatism is just capitalism" would be a bit upsetting, even if that word has two meanings, and I did consider changing it, but it's still true, just on a different level. Corporatism in this sense is just baby fascism. Fascism is just capitalism in decay, i.e., corporatism is just capitalism. It's all just capitalism, so I don't think I'll give it its own video. However, somewhat ironically, I find myself reading and responding to one of the primary texts of corporatist ideology. Since Rerum Novarum is the Catholic Church's official endorsement of corporatism, Leo doesn't use the word corporatism, though it's pretty clear they're talking about the same thing, and there's historical records that Leo knew about corporatism and supported it. For instance, he commissioned an advisory group of theologians to study corporatist politics prior to writing Rerum Novarum, just to make sure this was the route he wants to go down, and it is. Rerum Novarum pretty explicitly endorses the position that classes should work together, and even the idea that they need each other. Each needs the other. Capital cannot do without labor, nor labor without capital. I almost don't want to write this section because I kind of did already. Go watch the last two videos I made about Sean O'Brien and corporations. I guess they weren't direct enough, so at risk of sounding repetitive, here's my official response to this excuse for politics. The idea that classes should set aside their differences and get along ignores what economic classes are. They aren't just different groups of people, they're dialectically connected. The existence of one implies the existence of the other. Consider Engels' definition of proletariat in The Principles of Communism. The proletariat is that class in society which lives entirely from the sale of its labor and does not draw profit from any kind of capital. Because value production requires capital to metabolize labor into commodities, and proletarians are partly defined by not owning capital, it follows that an external party must possess it, i.e. the capitalist class. Workers need means by which to convert their labor into value, and are thus entirely dependent on people who own those means. Capitalists use this dependency as leverage to coerce proletarians to work for them. Thus, capital is not just means of production, it's a social relation. It's the means by which the capital class wields power over the working class. Classes are connected by exploitation by definition. The conflict is built into the dynamic. The conflict is occasionally exacerbated by the realization that workers don't actually need capitalists. Capitalists need workers, despite Leo's sentiment. The capital relation is just a construct, because in order for production to take place, all you need is labor, means of production, and a space for it all to happen. But means of production are only capital when they're monopolized by capitalists. It's entirely possible that the same people who labor could also own the means to convert their labor into products. Once people realize this, the capitalist class appears less like people who give you a job and more like an unnecessary middleman, since they do not perform productive labor. They only own the means for you to labor, and there's nothing preventing workers from taking these means for themselves, except the idea that the resulting society would be impossible. And that's really it. The working class could rise up at any time to overpower the capitalist class. There's a lot more of us than there are of them. All that's stopping us is ideology. And one strain of that ideology is corporatism. And I'm starting to notice a trend. This idea seems to pop up when workers organize. I doubt anyone would have cared to formalize it unless workers were in the early stages of class consciousness. After all, it's not like anybody who isn't already sold on either Marxism or fascism is sitting down and thinking hard about class dynamics. It seems to me that the primary function of corporatism isn't harmony between classes, but to ameliorate the revolutionary energy the class dynamic naturally produces. It does this by convincing one class that it isn't being exploited. It doesn't deny the existence of classes. By the time this ideology comes around, it's too late for that, but it isn't too late to confuse people. The fact that it arrives at this specific point in class development makes it particularly dangerous, because the energy it's responding to doesn't just disappear, and more often than not gets channeled away from socialism and into reactionary politics, like it did in Italy 40 years later. Corporatist ideology crops up after trade unions start to form, like the Italian unions before 1922. It's not a real politics. It only arrives to confuse the labor movement. Union members don't have to be well-read in theory, economics, or history. They just have to follow the union, and this is not the same as having a clearly articulated political program. The fact is, trade unions by themselves aren't enough to affect real change in society. A lot of leftists like to believe that bringing back unions will lead to class consciousness and could even catalyze revolution. But when you study theory and history, trade unions are the bare fucking minimum. You can't just have them and let them alone, because they become susceptible to things like Rerum Novarum. This tendency did not go unnoticed by theorists like Luxemburg, Lenin, and Malatesta, all of whom cautioned that unions are necessary but ultimately create their own limitations and aren't inherently revolutionary and even become conservative. Lenin would even write that the working class acting by itself would only ever develop trade union consciousness, as opposed to class consciousness. On the flip side, I think this insight was also apparent to certain conservatives. Rerum Novarum is a clear example, but also the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act, which placed severe restrictions on unions in America. One of its provisions is that no union executives are permitted to be communists, and the clear reason for this is that unions without communists are kind of useless and susceptible. The rejection of class collaborationism is a core feature of the communist framework, because the rejection of classes is, but you can totally convince a trade union that all it needs is negotiating rights, which is nice, but ultimately doesn't solve the problem. Exploitation is built into the class dynamic. You don't get rid of it by asking them to be nice to each other. It reminds me a bit of Leviticus's elaborate list of rules and regulations for keeping slaves, or the bit in Reliance of the Traveler, which details how and when you may physically discipline your wives. It's nice of them to set some restrictions on it, I guess, but that doesn't really address the underlying issue. In fact, it kind of reinforces it. The people who wrote these things did so thinking they were being merciful, that they were establishing codes of justice, but they weren't. They were written to accommodate both sides, but you can't do that when one side is inherently antithetical to justice. It isn't enough to compromise with it, it has to be destroyed. It doesn't matter if there's a limit to exploitation, there should be no exploitation. There should be no hierarchy. There should only be freedom in the fullest, most unapologetic sense possible. And that necessarily means the abolition of capitalism. By direct corollary, this presupposes abolition of the bourgeoisie, abolition of the commodity form, and, important for this essay, abolition of the state. Along with capital and labor, Leo dedicates a rather large portion of Rerum Novarum to the limits and legitimacy of state intervention. Most of these limits have to do with providing systems of aid to people or breaking up the family, something he associates with socialists. Leo, like modern conservatives, frames this as limitation for the state, yet in the very same document, not even 2 paragraphs later, he explicitly endorses state intervention to quell striking workers. Leo embodies one of the core contradictions of conservative politics, i.e., he is nominally suspicious of the state and even anti-state intervention, yet simultaneously he is fully in favor of state power precisely where it needs to be checked. And if you'll excuse my digression, I think this is a good opportunity to talk about the relationship between capitalism and the state. This relation is often assumed by leftists as an unspoken premise, which makes talking to conservatives difficult because they do not share this premise. Conservatives tend to think leftists want more government, and they find evidence for this everywhere they look. They make a big deal about how much they hate the government, and naturally assume that their enemies must take up the contrary position. Very narcissistically, it's pretty uncommon that they actually inquire as to what our positions are. It might come as a shock to certain among them that our stated goal is, and has been, to abolish the state entirely. A big aspect of the ideology underlying conservative politics is the notion that government is by nature corrupt and inefficient. Therefore, as many tasks as possible should be allocated to the market rather than a government agency. Since this is the conservatives' only metric for freedom, it's easy to see the free market and conclude that this is as free as it gets, and to regard any attempt to regulate trade as an affront to freedom. And this is a good example of how left politics emerged from the Enlightenment, as people began to realize that the methods posed by liberalism were insufficient to attain the ideals set by liberalism, because this notion of freedom is fundamentally deficient. If we regard freedom simply as freedom from state intervention in the market, this pushes aside all the other freedoms which the market will violate. Left unchecked, capitalists would have people working 15-hour days. There would be no weekends, overtime, holidays, health insurance, unemployment, etc. And we know this because they had people working like that until workers, inspired by writers like Marx and Engels, put a stop to it. There's no point in right to assembly if you have no time to assemble, nor any remaining land to assemble on. There's no point in the Second Amendment if there are no trade unions left to organize a rebellion. There is no free speech if your boss can fire you without reason. What's the point in democracy when you can just buy elections? And capital absolutely buys elections. Elon Musk gave Donald Trump's campaign no less than $277 million because he knew Trump's presidency would benefit him. Why wouldn't he? The capital class has all the money in America. They would be insane not to spend it on politicians that benefit them. They own all the news. They can finance propaganda to persuade Americans to vote a certain way. They can purchase smear campaigns, or even finance the other party's smaller candidates to try and divide us. Once politicians are elected, their money is spent on lobbyists, political action committees. Candidates, especially House representatives, have to keep running to stay in office, and that campaign money has to come from somewhere. On some level, I hate left politics, because this sounds like a conspiracy theory, but I'm literally just describing the way American politics works. A conspiracy is a plot created by evil people to do something evil. But nobody planned for this to happen. It's not like capitalists are all gathered in a dark lair somewhere, plotting the downfall of society. It's just that they have money, and the things that benefit them are bad for everyone else. They aren't trying to be evil. They're just rational actors doing things based on their self-interest, and owing to the circumstances they find themselves in, this has placed them at the highest levels of government. Marx puts it succinctly in the manifesto. The bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry and the world market, conquered for itself in the modern representative state exclusive political sway. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. Conservatives make a really big deal about how the state is corrupt and inefficient, how it's filled with people who don't relate to their constituents. But it does not occur to them that one reason the state is so terrible is simply because it's staffed by people who do not share their material interests. The conservative mind, blissfully unbothered by things like nuance, concludes that government must be flawed inherently. There is, however, a contradiction. Abolition of the state is the ideal of left politics, and whatever the conservative is, he most certainly is not that. He therefore concludes that government must be made as small as possible, but never entirely done away with. Here, another nuance escapes him. What is meant by small? They talk a lot about how they want to shrink the state, how they want to do away with wasteful spending, but as we've seen time and time again, they aren't all that good at saving money. Doge is just the latest instantiation of this, but it's been an ideal for them at least as long as I can remember. Does firing government employees make the government smaller? In one sense, certainly. In one sense, it certainly does, since there are fewer members of the government. However, I think what is meant by smaller is less powerful, and it by no means makes the government less powerful. While the state ideal for conservative politics has been to make it smaller, the leftist ideal has always been to make it more democratic. This goal necessarily involves incorporating more and more people into the state, whether by expanding voting rights to women, or adding new government agencies, or by dramatically expanding Congress, which we should really do. However, because this simultaneously expands the number of people involved in the state while also limiting the market, it's easy to mistake it as just government overreach. But I'd like to point out precisely what is happening here and how it's different from a power grab. First and foremost, it's important that we clarify what a state is. States are taken for granted by most people as relatively eternal, necessary, even divinely ordained institutions. This is, for example, how American nationalism wants you to view the state. But this is clearly not the case, since most countries only last for around 250 years. A better analysis can be found in Max Weber, who defines the state as that institution which has a monopoly on violence over a given territory. This is an incredibly sober definition, entirely sidestepping any notion that the state is some kind of God-ordained, transcendent institution. Instead, in Weber's view, the state is really just the largest gang. It's very material, which is what makes it so attractive to leftist analysis. This definition also specifies that the state is a monopoly, controlled by a minority of the population. This is the origin of representative democracy, which does not allow political participation, but does allow partial participation in the selection of those who have the right to political participation. The monopolistic nature of the state is central to understanding Marxism. Marx wrote, "In true democracy, the political state disappears." What does he mean by this? Well, if the state is just a monopoly held by a minority of the population, and democracy is popular participation in politics, it stands to reason that pure democracy is in fact entirely antithetical to the state. At the point where you have every citizen participating in political decision-making, you have, by definition, incorporated them into the state apparatus. However, at this point, it is no longer a minority of society because everyone is participating in it. The state would cease to be a state, and we would be left with a kind of democracy that surpassed the state, which no longer needs the state. Thus, by incorporating more and more people into the state, you do not increase state power. Far from it. You, in fact, disperse it amongst the population, and this eventually results in the dissolution of the state itself. On the flip side, when conservatives try to shrink the state, they never actually give up state power. All they're actually doing is concentrating existing state power in fewer and fewer hands, making the remaining state authorities more and more powerful. Thus, conservative power consolidation is framed as shrinking the state, and leftist democratization of the state is viewed as expanding state control. In a very ironic turn, the conservative desire for small government ends up being the precise catalyst for big government. All it does is concentrate more power in fewer and fewer hands, i.e., it creates oligarchy. That was a long digression, so let's get back to Rerum Novarum. Leo writes that socialists would substitute in its stead a system of relief organized by the state, but no human expedience will ever make up for the devotedness and self-sacrifice of Christian charity. I think this is just very unrealistic. Individual Christians, by virtue of their atomization, are not organized and therefore unable to provide relief as effectively as a more organized institution like a state. Individual Christians can become more organized by incorporating more and more into the state, as previously discussed, but Leo doesn't want this. Really, he knows this is bullshit, but advocating state control, in his mind, is the same as advocating socialism, which is the boundary he won't cross. So he ends up perpetuating poverty by not allowing for any practical solutions to poverty. So Rerum Novarum religiously defends property rights and capitalist class division, but it also spends a lot of time acknowledging the plight of poor people. Having rejected any structural solutions to this problem, what kind of solution does it propose? Charity. Just charity. Nothing to address the underlying causes of poverty or any kind of organizing. It kind of prohibits any sort of state intervention. Just do more charity. This isn't even consistent with Christianity. Christianity itself makes it a point to tell you that humans are sinful. Humans have fallen from grace. Like, we are bad people in the eyes of religion. You cannot teach that and also expect humans to solve poverty through charity. Charity itself should not exist. That's not to say you shouldn't give money to poor people. You absolutely should. But religion elevates this into an eternal category. It premises that the existence of poor people requiring charity is natural and normal. But if you're truly concerned about helping people in poverty, why not alleviate the conditions that put them in poverty in the first place? Because it isn't a natural state of affairs, as many people would like you to believe. It's directly tied to capitalism, which impoverishes certain people by refusing them work and systematically siphons surplus value away from the people it allows to work. I said at the beginning that to better understand this document, we should contextualize it in the history it emerged from. You should know that the Pope used to rule a much larger country called the Papal States, which lasted since 1756, but which was in steady decline when Rerum Novarum was being written. The Papal States' persistence and stability was due in part to the Catholic Church's influence on neighboring countries, and we can view the dissolution of the Papal States as the direct corollary of Catholicism's waning influence. As previously noted, the Catholic Church was a main antagonist in the French Revolution. Previously, the Catholic Church played a central role in the French government, but this was effectively put an end to by the Revolution. Later, when the revolutions of 1848 swept across Europe, the Papal States faced popular uprisings by Italian nationalists and liberals, and the Pope was forced to flee the Vatican to neighboring Gaeta, which was more friendly to him. The Pope eventually returned to Vatican, though basically under house arrest from the Kingdom of Italy. The Kingdom of Italy wanted national unification, which meant conquering the Papal States, but they didn't want to risk religious civil war, and so decided to just let the Pope stay in Vatican. The Papal States were officially dissolved in 1870, when they were annexed by Italy, leaving only the Vatican and threatening to arrest the Pope should he ever come out. This hostility between Italy and the Pope lasted right up till World War II, when Mussolini officially signed a peace treaty and recognized the sovereignty of Vatican City. So, the power of the Catholic Church was steadily declining throughout the 1800s, and the Catholic Church could see this. Going hand in hand with this, people were becoming less religious. Rerum Novarum, and many other documents from this time, talk a lot about the prevailing moral degeneracy, and it's not difficult to connect this trend to capitalism. And this is another appeal of corporatist ideology. On the one hand, the Pope can't support socialism. On the other, it's pretty clear that capitalism erodes the sacred, which is ultimately bad for something sacred like Catholicism. Mark Fisher, talking about Deleuze and Guattari, wrote about this when he described capitalism as a kind of dark potentiality which haunted all previous social systems. Capitalism, they argue, is the unnameable thing, the abomination, which primitive and feudal societies warded off in advance. When it actually arrives, capitalism brings with it a massive desacralization of culture. It is a system which is no longer governed by any transcendent law. On the contrary, it dismantles all such codes, only to reinstall them on an ad hoc basis. This desacralization, combined with the very real political turmoil of 1848, led Pius IX, the Pope who had to flee in the 1848 uprisings, to call the First Vatican Council, which lasted from 1869 to 1870, and aimed to defend Catholicism against modernity, affirm Catholic teachings, and affirm the authority of the Pope. Out of all of this fell Rerum Novarum. This document has had a very ambiguous legacy. Many people will argue that it has led to the spread of workers' rights in the modern world, especially in majority Catholic countries. And this isn't just good press for Catholicism, it's true. For example, Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno were read and appreciated by the founder of Mondragon, which is the largest worker cooperative in the world, and a crowning achievement of leftist activism. If you go to the Catholic school that I did, they will waste no time telling you that Rerum Novarum was a central text in the Polish Solidarity movement, and their eventual independence from the Soviet Union in 1989, which is interesting, and I think I'll make a video about it eventually. It led to the creation of child labor laws in countries like Austria, Italy, and France. In many ways, it was actually a very progressive document, especially for its time. However, this is not without ambiguity. As previously mentioned, it laid the ideological foundation for fascism. I think the corporatist ideology can be seen most clearly and is most dangerous within trade unions, where, like a cancer, it destroys its victim from within. And for that reason, I think Rerum Novarum will become more and more relevant as workers' organizations return to this country, as it will be an invaluable resource in curbing their effectiveness. We know, for example, that Rerum Novarum was very influential on Samuel Gompers, founder of the American Federation of Labor. Now, say what you will about the good the AFL has done, but this was the first trade union to expressly distance itself from the more radical socialist tendencies of other former American trade unions, like Knights of Labor and the International Workers of the World. This is far too big a topic to go into in this video, but the prominence of AFL in the American labor movement I think can be attributed precisely to how ineffectual it is. Because one way for capitalists to dismantle union power is by working with and supporting less effective unions in effort to kneecap effective unions. Kind of like how conservative donors will sometimes financially support the shittier candidate in Democratic primaries in order to ensure the more progressive candidates won't win, but I digress. My point is that Rerum Novarum only exists because of the church's waning influence. It did have some positive influence on workers' rights, but it also created fascism, which is bad. Finally, this is just a bad reading of Christianity. My roommate made a really good point about how Jesus is like the least concerned person with property you could possibly imagine. I think this is obvious to anyone who seriously engages with scripture, but it also seems like it was exceedingly clear to his disciples, judging by the communities they set up after Jesus died, where all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. There was no needy persons among them, for from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. You know, like a commune. There is, as far as I can tell, no scriptural basis for collaboration between classes. The best I can think of is render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but the underlying premise in that verse is that it doesn't matter because Rome is of this world, and Christianity is ultimately concerned with the kingdom of God, which is beyond this world. Jesus does spend a lot of time pissing off people who want the Messiah to be some sort of violent revolutionary, to destroy their Roman oppressors, only to be disappointed by love thy enemy. But this too takes place in a context where it ultimately doesn't matter because the point isn't to conquer Rome, it's to get to heaven. The message isn't that the Hebrews should get along with the Romans, it's that the Romans don't matter in the grand scheme of things. It strikes me as fundamentally anti-Christian to hear the commandment, help the poor, and limit interpretations of this to fundamentally ineffectual solutions, as though giving money to homeless people is some kind of ritual you do to get closer to God, rather than real material aid for homeless people. To sum up, Rerum Novarum is a complicated document with an ambiguous legacy. Its stated goal is to outline the respective rights of capital and labor, and in a very restricted sense, I think it succeeds in that endeavor. Rights are constructed, and you can absolutely construct ineffectual systems of rights. In a more concrete sense, it clearly fails. It fails to protect workers, or to change the society that endangers them. Rerum Novarum is in many ways a clear ideological precursor to fascism, in its emphasis on strict traditionalist social hierarchy, in its insistence on property rights, and in its vision for corporatism. It does not comprehend the failure of the internal logic of corporatism, or it does and chooses to ignore it in order to perpetuate unjust hierarchy. It religiously defends a system of property rights which, very ironically, lead to fewer and fewer people owning property, despite his stated conviction that more and more people should become landed property owners. All of his solutions are utterly ineffectual. He wants unions just so long as they don't do anything. He wants regulation of child labor, but nowhere does he actually condemn child labor. It's clear that he's fine with capitalist exploitation, and it's very clear that his primary concern is not to aid the working class, but to ameliorate their revolutionary energy through minor reforms. Its message is antithetical to the Gospels. Its non-focus on the ideas of Jesus shouldn't be too surprising, since it was written at a moment of political turmoil for the Papal States, when the Vatican had a particular interest in quelling revolution, more so than strict theological questions. Rerum Novarum's influence will continue to prove ambiguous, and this ambiguity is precisely why it persists. Depending on your outlook and the society and time you read it in, you can come away with entirely opposite messages. Depending on the context, Rerum Novarum is an argument for more workers' rights, or no workers' rights. Its relevance is a function of the time and place. We should be particularly wary of its relevance in America as trade unions return, since this is exactly the context where the owning class will stress their supposed necessity in society. I don't think it's super relevant right now, since less than 10% of Americans are union members, but that number is rising. If it keeps rising, and let's hope it does, American workers will become closer and closer to class consciousness, to the realization that they are defined by laboring for others, that other is fundamentally not necessary for production to continue. And this is precisely the context where an obfuscation like Rerum Novarum would benefit the capital class. Leo XIV hasn't been Pope for that long. I hope he has no intentions of making use of this obfuscation, though I am choosing to be cautiously optimistic. Only time will tell how he chooses to interpret his namesake, but for now, I'd like to make a prediction. I believe Leo XIV's first encyclical letter will concern artificial intelligence, which is a topic he touched on in his first speech as Pope, and which is precisely the sort of timely issue encyclical letters are written about. And I think this will mark a pivotal moment in the history of the Church's politics, because, as far as I can tell, the only solution to the problems presented by AI is to admit that capitalism has finally reached a point it cannot pass without causing the literal destruction of human society, or some kind of Butlerian jihad. Either solution would be interesting, and I hope I'll get to make a video about it in the future. Anyways, I really appreciate it if you made it all the way to the end of the video. My throat really hurts. I hope you learned something, or at least found it entertaining. These videos take an enormous amount of work to research, write, and record, but it's one of the most satisfying outlets I can think of. I write compulsively, and I'm very grateful to live at a time when I can publish my ramblings on a platform like YouTube, where for some reason people will choose to listen to them. That said, it is a lot of work, which is why I don't publish nearly as often as I'd like to. I don't want to start a Patreon because subscription services are kind of antithetical to my values. That's not to say I'll never have a Patreon, but not for the time being. Monthly subscriptions just sort of rub me the wrong way. But I did set up a Buy Me a Coffee if any of you particularly enjoyed this video and would like to leave me a tip. If you'd rather not, don't feel pressured. I'm just happy people seem to enjoy my videos, but if you can, I'd really appreciate it. Anyways, thanks for watching, happy reading, and good luck organizing effective resistances.